Thanks a lot for remembering that in the spring, the fiscal monitor was devoted to the great election year that was our theme. At this point in time, we have already elections in many countries. We have in some countries forthcoming elections. You mentioned the US and Japan. But just think, in 2024, more than 90 countries or political entities around the world held or are expected to hold general elections. Those entities represent more than half the world population, more than 4 billion people. They represent well above half of world GDP. So it's truly a great election year, and it's influencing politics and fiscal policies all over the world. It's something which is probably politically unprecedented. Now, the research at the IMF has shown that political discourse in many places of the world is turning pro-fiscal support, it is turning pro-fiscal expansion. The calls in political discourse for fiscal restraint, the emphasis on fiscal discipline are on the downside. Also, evidence collected in that research shows that when you have such a shift in discourse, there is pressure on public spending at about half percentage point of GDP for the coming years. And therefore, we have been emphasizing the importance to follow and understand political factors as determinants of fiscal policy. When it comes to the great election year, as I said, the great election year is still ongoing. Important elections are still in the pipeline, and even after the year is over, we'll have to wait patiently for some time before we can figure out what the interplay of politics and fiscal policy has been. So let me emphasize that the emphasis on price stability as the main element of monetary stability and financial stability applies in Japan as well. In Japan, I would claim the need to anchor inflation and inflation expectations at target is particularly strong. That concern is particularly strong given that Japan had inflation below target and interest rates constrained by the effective lower bound for a very long period of time. So it's very important to have the anchor where policymakers want the nominal anchor to be. Now, clearly, the situation in Japan when it comes to public debt is one of very elevated debt. According to our projections, in Japan, debt will go above 250% of GDP this year, and then it is projected to come down slowly and gradually to something like 245% by the end of the projection horizon. In our view, to create the best possible environment for monetary stability, financial stability, and growth and prosperity in Japan, it's very important that fiscal policy pivots towards fiscal adjustment and the rebuilding of fiscal buffers in the near term so that Japan does have the necessary space to cope with future shocks and to cope with underlying pressures on spending that come from, for example, from the very rapid demographic transition and population aging that is going on in Japan ahead of most other economies in the world. So you have to think about it from a medium and long-term perspective, and bear in mind that what is going on now in Japan is a transition to a regime where we hope and expect that inflation and inflation expectations will be anchored at the inflation target. And what is important for the public debt dynamic in Japan is real interest rate. Another aspect which is very important is real growth rate. And so fiscal policy from a medium to long-term perspective should also be seen as structural policy aiming at growth and competitiveness of the Japanese economy, and be seen together with other strategies that Japan will want to have to promote sustainable growth. Quality of public finances, quality of public spending is extremely important. In the fiscal monitor, we emphasize the projection 3 years ahead. And if we look at that projection for the world, we see that the deviation between the most likely outcome and a severe adverse scenario that would coincide with the 95th percentile, the deviation would be a full 20 percentage points of GDP. If that were to materialize, if that severe adverse scenario would materialize, global public debt would be 115% of GDP, a very large number. We use this debt at risk framework and some other sources of risk that we also quantify in the fiscal monitor to say that public debt around the world may be associated with larger risks than what it seems. And we use that to give the very strong policy recommendation that there is no space for complacency, that almost everywhere around the world it is necessary to take decisive steps right now to put public debt under control and rebuild fiscal buffers. So we can, and we do, have estimates of debt at risk for individual countries. I think that those should be taken with a grain of salt, but I'm happy to share with you what the results for Japan are. So if you think about Japan, you see that in the period of the pandemic, the debt to GDP ratio in Japan increased by 22 percentage points of GDP. We have already been through the fact that at this point in time, debt to GDP in Japan is above 250%, and it's projected to slowly coming down to 245 by the end of the decade. If one has a severe adverse scenario in Japan, the jump up in public debt would be larger than what happened during the year of the pandemic. So clearly, it's also the case that for Japan, debt risks are considerable, and that reinforces the case for fiscal policy action to bring public debt under control and rebuild fiscal efforts in the near term. We believe that fiscal adjustment in the near term is called for, and it's a very important priority for Japan. The way it is done depends on policy and political priorities in Japan, and depends on how fiscal policy comes together with monetary policy, structural policies, and so how the package as a whole looks like. What seems to me to be the crucial guiding principle when it comes to taxation is that taxation and what is done with the Japanese tax system should be part of an overall medium-term strategy that at the same time brings public debt under control while allowing for investment in people, a people-oriented investment effort, and is consistent with a medium to long-term growth strategy for the Japanese economy. So I've been arguing that since Japan is strongly affected by very important and profound long-term trends, of which demographics, the shrinking of Japanese population, the aging of Japan, which is a phenomenon that is happening in many other places of the world, but Japan was ahead in that process, suggests that challenges to the Japanese economy and Japanese public finances are long-term challenges. That does suggest the need for a long-term strategy, and that can be well served by a credible medium-term fiscal framework.